Okay, great. So yeah, hello everybody. It's great to be at this session, if only from the distance. So I'm going to talk to you about what is it like to be a group agent. And if there are any problems with the audio or video, you must let me know if, for instance, you can't hear me. Okay, so let me get started straight away. So by now, many philosophers and social scientists accept that suitably organized collectives can be intentional agents in their own right, over and above the individual members. And examples of group agents that are frequently mentioned include entities like commercial corporations, collegial courts, non-governmental organizations, and according to some people, even states in their entirety. Now, the question that I want to discuss today is the following. If we accept that there are group agents, should we also accept that there is such a thing as group consciousness? Now, many of you will be familiar with a famous article by Thomas Nagel from the 1970s, which was titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" And in this article, Nagel suggested that the defining mark of a conscious organism is that there is something it is like to be that organism. So, for example, there is clearly something it is like to be a human being. And similarly, we also assume that there is something it is like to be a chimpanzee, or something it is like to be a cat, a dog, or any other mammal. So all of those can perceive the world, have experiences, perhaps feelings of pleasure and pain, and so on. Now, on the other hand, we think that there is nothing that it is like to be a rock, table, or a chair. So those inanimate objects clearly do not have consciousness. Now, what I want to ask in this talk is whether group agents are more like cats, dogs, and bats in this respect, or even humans, or whether they are more like rocks, tables, and chairs. And I should actually note that some people express skepticism about the idea that there are group agents precisely because they are skeptical about such a thing as group consciousness. And so getting a firm grip on the question of whether there can be group consciousness may actually also shed some light on what we think about group agency. So here's what I'm just going to do in the following minutes. I'm first going to give you a very quick introduction to the notion of group agency. Then I'll say a few words about consciousness. Then I'm going to ask whether group agents are conscious and how we might think about that question. And then very briefly, I'm going to conclude with the normative implication of all of this. So what is a group agent? Now, I think the right strategy to approach this question is simply to take a very general and permissive definition of agency, not a definition that is tailor-made for collectives, and then to go and apply this general definition of agency to the case of groups. And this is the approach that Philip Pettit and I take in our joint book on group agency. So what is an agent then? Well, we like to think about agency in functionalist terms, and an agent in this sense is simply a system that has beliefs, desires, and an ability to act on the basis of those states. So what are beliefs and desires? Well, we can think of beliefs and desires simply as, on the one hand, representational states, which are functional states of the system that depict certain features of its environment as the system takes the environment to be. And then desires are motivational states of the system whose functional role is to depict certain features of the environment as the system would like to be. And then the system's capacity to act is simply a capacity to intervene in the environment based on these states. Or in simple terms, we call this the pursuit of the system's desires in light of its beliefs. Now, if we take this general definition, then humans, chimpanzees, dogs, and even bats all qualify as agents under this definition. And similarly, sufficiently complex robots, perhaps in the future, might qualify as agents as well. And of course, it goes without saying that consistently with those conditions, agents can vary very significantly in their capacities and sophistication. Clearly, human beings are intentional agents of unprecedented sophistication compared to any other agent that we have Oh, whether a group could meet the agency conditions depends very much on how that group is organized. So if you take a random collective, the people who happen to be in the supermarket right now, that's clearly not an organized collective, and we wouldn't call it a group agent. On the other hand, a suitably organized collective with the appropriate internal structure, decision-making procedures, relevant rules for organizing its conduct, such an organized collective may very well meet those conditions. And even economists who tend to be methodological individualists of a very strong form would accept that commercial corporations can be viewed as group agents in this sense, insofar as we have well-confirmed theories of the firm that do indeed model commercial corporations as belief desire agents of the kind that I've defined. Okay, so why should we postulate the existence of group agents? Well, the idea is simply that in science, the criterion for whether we should treat an entity or a property as real in a particular domain, whether we should take it at face value, that question should be answered by our best scientific theories of that domain. And now it is arguable that our best social scientific theories of certain phenomena, for instance, the behavior of firms in the market, do attribute belief, desire, agency of this functionalist kind to some of the collectives involved, by representing them as agents in the decision and game theoretic sense, for example. And so this means that, at least in a naturalistic sense of ontological commitment, those theories are really committed to group agents. And so a scientific realist would then have good reasons, at least defeasibly, to take those theories' commitment to group agency at face value. And I think that's a very good reason for social scientists to take group agents to be literally real. So let me quickly move on to consciousness. So what is consciousness? Well, we use the term consciousness to refer to a whole number of different phenomena, and I'm going to adopt the terminology introduced by David Chalmers, an influential philosopher of mind, who distinguishes between consciousness as awareness on the one hand and consciousness as experience on the other hand. And I think that's a very important distinction. So let me just very briefly describe those two distinct notions of consciousness. So on the awareness side, we say that someone is conscious of a given fact or a given piece of information simply to indicate that he or she is cognitively aware of it. For example, he knows it or believes it or is able to access it. Similarly, we speak of someone's conscious state to refer to everything that this person is currently aware of, for instance, everything within his or her scope of attention. Similarly, we say that someone is conscious to indicate that he or she is not asleep or comatose, but instead cognitively attentive and awake. Now, crucially, all of these different awareness notions that I've just illustratively enumerated are functionalist notions, and they can be studied using ordinary scientific tools from a third-person perspective, as people do in psychology and in neuroscience. Now, these functionalist notions of consciousness as awareness contrast very starkly with consciousness as experience. And we use the term experience, this stronger, distinct notion of consciousness, to refer to what someone subjectively experiences. What is it like to be that agent from the first-person perspective? So this would include things like the experience of colors and sounds, the smell of a rotten egg, the experience of pleasures and pains, subjective feelings, and so on. The kind of thing that you can only experience from your own first-person perspective. Now, unlike awareness, phenomenal experience is not a functionalist notion, and it doesn't easily lend itself to a third-person analysis. Instead, it has an irreducible first-person character, and that's exactly this "what is it like to be" idea that Nagel introduced famously. And the hard problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers and other philosophers of science, philosophers of mind discuss it, is precisely to explain why we have phenomenal experience at all. Why are we not zombies, systems that are functionally like us but have no first-person experience? That's really the hard problem of consciousness. Now, through the lens of these distinctions, let's now ask whether group agents are conscious. And I want to begin with a modest positive claim here, which is that group agents can certainly have consciousness as awareness in this functionalist sense. So we can meaningfully talk about which information a group agent, let's say the police, is aware of in an investigation. We can equally talk about which things a group agent attends to or not. So an organization that has been struck by a scandal might give its attention to this and then act to become clean, for instance, by adopting a new policy or a new code of conduct. We can also make sense of the idea of perceptual awareness in a group agent. So a group agent has various routes of epistemic access to the world. These are, of course, mediated through the members and procedures of this group agent in much the same way in which an individual person's perception is mediated through sense organs and through cognitive processes. So a group agent may be sensitive to some features of the environment, but not to others. Just as we humans are sensitive to sounds at certain frequencies, but we are not sensitive to sounds outside that range. While dogs, let's say, are sensitive to sounds in a different frequency range. So in this respect, dogs can be aware of certain features that we cannot be aware of. And then, of course, the converse also. Now, even the notions of wakefulness and sleep make some sense in a group agent, although they sound a little bit more metaphorical here. So let's take my university, the London School of Economics. It goes on vacation from time to time. All offices and activities are closed, all email servers go into an out-of-office mode, all official business is put on hold, and the group agent will then wake up and respond during the break only in a real emergency, for example, a scandal that is suddenly uncovered by the press. And this parallels the way in which a sleeping person or a sleeping animal may wake up in a threatening situation. So from a functionalist perspective, I think consciousness as awareness can be present in a group agent as much as it can be present in an individual agent or in a robot. So there is no particular philosophical puzzle here. But the harder problem now is what I already described as the hard problem of consciousness in the case of individual agents, which is whether group agents can also have consciousness as experience. There are some people who think that yes, group agents can have consciousness as experience. So Eric Schwitzgebel, a philosopher from the University of California, argues in a recent article that if materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious, which is an extremely provocative claim. Now, in the written paper that accompanies this talk, and which you can access online on my webpage, I approached this question by going through several theories of the physical correlates of consciousness. And in particular, I focus on integrated information theory, which is a recently emerging theory of consciousness. On the one hand, that theory is still in its infancy, but as I will explain, it seems to be a promising contender for thinking about my question about group consciousness. So broadly speaking, integrated information theory asserts that phenomenal consciousness is associated with integrated information processing in a system. And so before defining a bit more precisely what this means, I just want to make a couple of remarks about how to interpret this claim about consciousness being associated with integrated information processing. I think this claim should be interpreted best not as a claim about what consciousness is, but rather as what philosophers call a psychophysical bridge principle, a principle which specifies which physical properties in the world are related to phenomenal properties. And this bridge principle is in principle, I think, compatible with a number of different philosophical views about consciousness. So asserting a bridge principle like this, or hypothesizing it, need not necessarily commit us to either materialism or dualism, so we can leave this debate somewhat open. But I'll set this issue aside, and I'll turn to the question of how to define integrated information. And the key idea is somewhat abstract, but still important, so I'll just run through a few definitions here. So take some system, so this could be the human cortex if we study it, or it could be a computational system, or it could be a collective system, whichever system we want to study. And then we need to ask whether, theoretically speaking, we can partition the system into two subsystems such that the processes in one subsystem do not depend much on the processes in the other. And specifically, this means that if we take the state configuration of one subsystem as given, and then hypothetically replace the other subsystem with a random process while leaving the entire functional architecture, all the connections intact, how much would this increase the entropy in the first subsystem? And if this increase in entropy is very low, then the first subsystem does not depend very much on the second. On the other hand, if the increase in entropy is very high, the first subsystem does depend very much on the second. So the idea here is, if you've got a complex system and you randomize the functioning of part of it while leaving all connections intact, how much does this disturb the functioning elsewhere? And if the disturbance propagates throughout the system, that is evidence that the system is highly integrated in its information processing, whereas if the disturbance through randomization of part of the system does not much affect the rest, then this is a sign that there is very little informational integration. And the proponents of integrated information theory, most notably the neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, then design a measure of the lowest possible entropy increase that could result from such a partition of the system into two parts, where we randomize one and then look at how that affects the other. And that measure of what the lowest possible entropy increase is through this hypothetical procedure is called phi, and it captures the level of informational integration in the system. Now, this theory is interesting because it now allows us to look at a whole variety of different systems and ask how informationally integrated are they according to this measure phi. And then we find some interesting points. For example, in the human brain, the cortex is highly integrated, while the cerebellum, another part of the brain, has a much lower level of informational integration according to this measure. And indeed, neuroscientists believe that the cortex is the locus of consciousness rather than the cerebellum. Likewise, we can ask, how does the measure of informational integration change in the brain when we go to sleep and when we go into a deep sleep phase, for instance? So neuroscientists think that in deep sleep, the measure of information integration is lower than it is when we are awake or than it is when we are in shallow sleep. And indeed, when we're awake and also in shallow sleep while dreaming, we do have subjective conscious experiences, while in deep sleep much less so. So all of these considerations are some evidence for this correlation between informational integration and consciousness. But at the same time, this notion is quite abstract, and so we can also study informational integration in other systems, including collective systems. Now, this is, of course, inevitably still quite speculative, because all of these ideas are in their infancies, but I do think that there are reasons to think that in a typical group agent of the sort that we find in the real world, like a commercial corporation, this measure of informational integration would be quite low in a group agent compared to, let's say, the human cortex or even the cortex of another mammal. Well, I think there are three reasons which I just very quickly flag here because I don't have much time. First of all, many group agents are decomposable into functionally relatively self-contained units, which are each internally more interdependent than they are dependent on other units. There is a huge amount of modularity in typical group agents. And so the global interconnectivity in a group agent is nothing like the one in the human cortex. If you think about the bandwidth of connections between neurons in the human cortex, it's orders of magnitude greater than the bandwidth that you would find in a commercial corporation. Secondly, suppose we identified the cortex analog of a group agent, speaking very, very metaphorically. Yeah, let's say it's board of directors or its governing assembly or something like this. If we hypothetically replace this with a random process or part of the random process, the non-randomized rest would of course be disturbed as a result of this, but nowhere near as extremely as as part of the cortex would be disturbed if there was a randomizing process in other parts of the cortex with all the connections being intact. And then finally, much of the information processing in a group agent can be attributed to information processing by the individual members. And arguably the computational contribution made by cross-member connections is quite moderate compared to the computational contribution made by the individual cognition of the members. And I think if we put all of this together, this suggests a relatively low level of information integration in a typical group agent. There is another reason why integrated information theory also speaks against group consciousness. So according to integrated information theory, whenever there is a nested hierarchy of subsystems, for example, different parts of the brain nested in one another, then consciousness is present at whichever layer maximizes informational integration. So for instance, the brain as a whole has non-zero informational integration, but the cortex has much higher informational integration, and hence the cortex, rather than the larger supersystem, is the locus of consciousness, is what neuroscientists tend to think. And in a group agent, presumably, consciousness would be located at the level of individual members, because informational integration at the level of each individual is far greater, given these considerations about bandwidth, than informational integration in the collective system as a whole. So the bottom line then is that according to integrated information theory, with respect to phenomenal experience, phenomenal consciousness, group agents seem to be much more like zombies, in quotes, than they are like human beings. So then, very quickly, a normative implication of all of this. So in my book on group agency with Philip Pettit, we asserted a normative asymmetry between individuals and groups. In particular, we argued that while group agents should be held responsible for their corporate actions, they should not be given the same rights as individuals. We insisted that group agents should be given only those rights that are defensible within a normatively individualist framework. And we also argued that group agents should be subject to especially strict checks and controls, given that group agents can have a tremendous amount of power over the social world. I mean, think about how powerful commercial corporations can be, for example. Now, we were criticized by others for not sufficiently justifying this normative asymmetry between individuals and groups. And one criticism was that the asymmetry seemed hard to defend in light of our functionalist account of agency. So there is a clear question to be asked here, namely, why should we be normative individualists if we are collectivists about agency? If individuals and groups are agents in the functionalist sense, how can we then draw the distinction? Now, the argument that I've sketched in this talk today, and also in the paper that accompanies it, opens one principal line of response. One could argue that a key difference in moral significance between individuals and group agents lies precisely in their difference with respect to phenomenal consciousness, in that individual human agents have phenomenal consciousness, while group agents are only agents in this thin functionalist sense, but they lack phenomenal consciousness. And for this reason, they are not of normative significance in the same way in which individual agents are, and so group agents could never have non-derivative rights, while individual agents certainly have non-derivative rights. We would not want to extend human rights, for example, to group agents. Now, developing this point about the normative implications is beyond the scope of this talk, but I do hope to have said enough to put it on the table for discussion. So let me just ask my question again: what is it like to be a group agent? And my conclusion is basically nothing.